I'm Tom Rogan, a Tony Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute, and today we have the fortune of being joined by Anastasia Lin, who is an actress and human rights advocate focused on China in particular. Anastasia, thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you for having me here.
So obviously, China, especially in the foreign policy dimension with the United States, but of course with increasing attention to the human rights situation in the mainland, and with relevance to Hong Kong more recently, is becoming a big story in the United States. What is your sort of first takeaway that you think people, Americans, should be focused on in this, really big issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, the threat that Chinese Communist Party poses had been for a very long time. It's closer to home than most people realize. And I think in the last year or so, half a year at least, that the policy has really shifted to take the Communist China's threat much more seriously. So I'm very happy that the awareness is there now, and it's more about what do we do about it. So a lot of my work is to channel the understanding between what has been happening and what the policymakers can do.
So one of the things that you have been articulating or talking about recently was framed in your recent Wall Street Journal opinion piece. Do you want to just give an overview to the viewers of what you were talking about there? Because you had some quite interesting ideas about how there might be a better way for government to and private companies to address some of the challenges that the CCP poses.
Sure. My op-ed is basically, it's written with a co-author with David Rifkin, who's a lawyer. And our idea is basically that corporations their priorities to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. But because of China's, communist China's threat, and they know a way to subtly impose, sometimes not very subtle, to impose their soft power on companies and to make them kowtow to the Chinese communist propaganda. And for example, changing Taipei in Taiwan as China Taipei, to just basically going with their propaganda rhetoric talking points. We found a way to try to strengthen American corporate spying a bit by basically making a law to make it illegal to cooperate in these kind of propaganda efforts of Chinese Communist government. And this idea, Dave and I reached it from a different, I guess, angle. For me, it's much more personal because I have been working on Chinese human rights for a very long time, and I have experienced intimidation from the embassy. Trust sponsors that I work with, organizations where I'm supposed to speak have been receiving intimidation directly or indirectly from the Chinese consulate. And at one point I was feeling extremely vulnerable because I know these companies, my sponsors are supposed to make money and that is their priority. I can't possibly ask them to give that up or give up the whole China market in order to support my work. And I don't think anybody is ready to take that kind of stance. So that felt extremely vulnerable. It's almost like me against the entire state. And now I bet a lot of corporations also feel like that. It's not that they want to support the criticism toward Hong Kong protests. It's also not that they want to say Taiwan is a part of China. It's because they really don't find the strength to do so, to oppose to that.
Yeah. Right. And one of the, it's interesting that you mentioned that idea of being or that fact of facing intimidation from the consulate. This is something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, that in the recently closed Houston consulate, the Ministry of State Security, effectively the Chinese equivalent of the CIA, uses its intelligence officers and diplomats abroad to sometimes eyeball to eyeball physically intimidate people in ways that are quite frankly outrageous. And the fact that people are not aware of this, I'm glad you mentioned that. It is a significant issue. And how do you feel in that regard then about Secretary of State Pompeo's recent decision to close the consulate in Houston?
Well, from what I have learned in the past from dissidents, friends, and things that happened to myself, the Chinese embassy oftentimes acts as a center for collecting information and espionage activities. And I definitely think that there's the validity in doing that. And also, China closed American consulate in China too. So, and I think these policies are going in a way that we now are finally accepting Chinese Communist Party for its true nature, for what it is, instead of what we hope them to be, which is in the past few decades we have been doing that and not very efficient.
Do you have any concerns that, as much as President Trump might have a somewhat transactional view of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, the United States is taking much more robust and concerted action to try and restrain the worst elements of that regime. Do you have any concerns that, were he elected, Joe Biden might pare back and return to the kind of Obama era, more conciliatory approach towards Beijing?
Well, I feel like the public awareness is to the point now because everybody is being affected by coronavirus. This is an undeniable fact. Even in the mainstream media, we might not be able to always say where it comes from, but everyone knows where it comes from. I have a feeling that the public opinion is not going to it's past the point of no return. We can't pretend to be blind anymore.
Do you think that there is a possibility, a likelihood even, that China might take a step back? And we saw Jimmy Lai, for example, recently, the voice really of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, who was detained and is going to face charges for essentially being a traitor, as China would say. Do you think there's a potential that the Communist Party might change course, be a little bit more moderate because of the pressure that's being put on? Or do you believe they're so ideologically intransigent that really this is a generational challenge?
Well, we see that with the release of Jimmy Lai, and some other things that happen, which we can discuss in the conference, China has been seen less brazen as they were before because they see very firm actions from the outside world against their bullying tactic, which is very different from the last 3 decades when they violated basically every promise that they have promised to WTO, to international law. So I guess they are feeling afraid now, and we can see it in the rhetoric in their state-owned media. So yeah.
So you mentioned the upcoming Freedom Conference that the Steamboat Institute is hosting. What are you going to be focused on there? What are you most excited about kind of engaging with the attendees?
Well, I always see it's part of my job to help people who never lived in China to understand that Chinese Communist Party is not the same as Chinese people.
Right.
There are a lot of people in China, me, my parents, my grandparents, their generation, they have been under basically the persecution of a totalitarian regime. But from the outside world's angle, they think that China is this huge Frankenstein's monster. But I think it's important to make the distinction that by standing with Chinese people, by opposing Chinese communist tyranny, you are standing with the real Chinese people. I wish to focus a little bit on that and also to really tell some stories probably that will give some insight to the nature of about the nature of the Communist Party.
On that point, how do you see, obviously, there is a rising middle class in a lot of urban areas of China. There's also a very poor rural class. How do you see those dynamics potentially playing out in challenges to the regime in the years to come, as people, find more awareness of how they are treated and people around the rest of the world are treated, and perhaps demand better government, more freedom? I mean, do you think that is something that will happen?
Well, I think that is something that already happened. The reason why we are not hearing these voices more loudly is because the internet censorship. And a lot of these comments and voices, when they appear on the internet, it's immediately deleted. But still, there are information and people's voices that got out. And I sensed a real shift in the last half a year where only from my own work, I see a lot of Chinese people climbing out the Great Firewall to voice their support. I think maybe partially the coronavirus has hit a primal spot, and that people know that there's no way that they can back up even more, and they have to speak for themselves now. We're seeing such a shift. And also, I think that the support from the outside, from the Western world, also plays a huge factor in sometimes I think the Western policymakers don't understand that even the symbolic gesture to support Chinese people who are under persecution or just living under the tyranny can really help them to stay there, to stay in their struggle a little longer, and to be a little more courageous. It means much more to them than we realize.
Right, right. And, you know, it has been, you know, we talk about this, you know, the idea of Hong Kong in the political context sometimes, and yet, you know, under immense pressure, we continue to see so many people finding the courage to demand the freedom that the Communist Party promised them under the Sino-British Accord, but really refusing to give in. And you know, I suppose as well that you mentioned this, if you look at the history of China as a country and the diversity of culture, the international politics of China going back, you know, more than 1,000 years, there's so much that isn't said, that the Communist Party, you know, provides this really fictional version of China that begins, you know, really with the rise of, you know, the insurgency and Mao. But you know, how much do you think that is something that Americans you know, need to sort of grapple with more, this idea of China not being this communist monolith as sometimes, or as often, that Beijing presents it to be?
That's right. I think it's there's so much more. We have more than 5,000 years of culture. Communist Party has only been there for 70 years.
Right.
And if there's anything I can bet my hopes on, is that our culture is way more resilient than a brittle communist regime. I've sensed that from talking with people, that Chinese people that are in my grandfather's generation, my father's generation, that have experienced the Cultural Revolution, which basically tried to take away the traditional culture from the surface and try to turn individual faculties off and make them all absolute conformity to the Chinese propaganda, communist propaganda. But
Yeah.
I realized that the spirit of the nation, the soul of the nation is still there. It's waiting to be connected and waken up.
So, you know, as we conclude, is there, you know, anything else you want to add about any projects that you're working on at the moment, what you might add at the Freedom Conference, or anything really?
Well, come to the conference, then we'll have a good chat.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end on. Anastasia Lin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.